What if I told you that the latest round of tariffs announced by Donald Trump isn't just another chapter in an ongoing trade dispute, but the opening move in a global economic transformation? Not a tweak to foreign policy, not a campaign stunt, but the first domino in something far bigger, something that could rewrite the rules of global trade, fracture old alliances, and realign the balance of economic power for decades to come. Trump's new tariffs aren't targeting just one industry or one country. They're aimed like precision strikes at sectors that underpin the very structure of the global economy: electric vehicles, steel, semiconductors, and even green energy components. These aren't just industries, they're pillars of what many economists call the Fourth Industrial Revolution. And hitting them comes with consequences far beyond the usual diplomatic fallout. The media is talking about higher prices, supply chain snarls, inflation spikes. And they're right, but that's just the surface. Beneath all the headlines is something more deliberate: a reset. An attempt to use tariffs as a tool to dismantle the old system and build something new in its place. Something that shifts control back to sovereign governments, breaks the dependency on foreign manufacturing, and reasserts economic nationalism in a world that's been dominated by globalization for the last 50 years. Prices are already reacting. Investors are nervous. And other nations are starting to retaliate. But here's what no one is talking about: what if this was all planned? What if rising costs at the supermarket, spiking interest rates, and fractured trade partnerships aren't signs of chaos, but calculated components of a strategy? A strategy not just to protect American jobs or punish foreign competitors, but to shake the foundation of the post-World War II economic order and replace it with something more controllable, more profitable, for some, and far more dangerous for others. This isn't just about Trump. It's not just about the United States. It's about the system itself. About who built it, who benefits from it, and who's now trying to take it apart. Whether you love or hate the former president, the truth is this: these tariffs are not isolated policies. They're signals. And they're triggering a cascade of reactions that will affect everything from the price of your groceries to the survival of multinational corporations. In this video, we're diving deep into the numbers, the history, the power plays, and the hidden beneficiaries. Because if Trump's tariffs are just step one, then what comes next could change everything you thought you knew about money, power, and the future of the global economy. Stay with us. Because once we start connecting the dots, the picture gets a lot clearer, and much more unsettling. What changed? Trump's latest tariff moves in 2024. Donald Trump re-entered the political stage with a familiar weapon in his arsenal: tariffs. But this time, they came sharper, broader, and with a far more strategic edge. Unlike the first wave of tariffs from his presidency between 2018 and 2019, which largely targeted raw materials like steel and aluminum, the new moves in 2024 and early 2025 took aim at the beating heart of future technologies. The world barely had time to brace itself before headlines declared a return to economic nationalism, and a dramatic escalation in trade warfare. The new tariff policy was first teased in late 2023 during Trump's campaign rallies, where he promised to bring jobs back to America and punish what he called unfair trade practices. But it wasn't until February 2024 that concrete details emerged. A proposed across-the-board 10% tariff on all imports was introduced, followed by sector-specific hikes designed to isolate certain economic competitors. By the time summer arrived, the policy was active, and the numbers were staggering. Imports from China were once again at the center of the storm. Electric vehicles manufactured in Chinese factories suddenly faced tariffs that had been raised to 100%, doubling their landed cost in the United States. The move effectively shut out affordable EVs from American consumers, especially models from BYD and NIO that had been gaining traction among cost-conscious buyers. And it wasn't just cars. Batteries, semiconductors, solar panels, and medical devices all faced sharp tariff increases. Imports that previously carried a duty of 10 or 20% were now taxed at 40% or more, depending on their classification. Mexico wasn't spared either. Even though it remains a key trade partner under the USMCA agreement, new tariffs were selectively applied to Mexican factories producing parts for electric vehicles and heavy machinery. Trump's argument was that these factories were simply Chinese operations relocated across the border to dodge direct sanctions, what he described as economic laundering. The new policy aimed to close that loophole, sending a clear message to both foreign investors and domestic manufacturers. The impact was immediate. According to the US Census Bureau, the value of targeted imports declined by over $30 billion within the first 6 months. US Customs and Border Protection reported a surge in tariff revenue, projecting an increase of nearly $100 billion annually if the current rates continued. While that number seems like a win on the surface, economists quickly warned of the ripple effects. Higher costs for manufacturers, delays in supply chains, and ultimately, inflated prices for end consumers were already showing up in monthly inflation reports. Public reaction was deeply divided. Some hailed the move as long overdue, a bold stroke of protectionism to restore American dominance in manufacturing. Supporters in the Midwest and parts of the South viewed the tariffs as a second chance to revive shuttered factories and reclaim lost jobs. On social media and conservative networks, hashtags like "Made in America" trended for days after the policy took effect. But the backlash was equally vocal. Economists warned of an artificial inflation cycle, as domestic companies raised their prices knowing that cheaper foreign alternatives were effectively blocked. Consumer advocacy groups pointed out that the average American would bear the cost, not China. In fact, the Peterson Institute for International Economics published a report showing that over 90% of the costs of tariffs historically fall on domestic consumers and businesses, not the exporting country. In other words, these policies are often stealth taxes dressed as patriotism. Meanwhile, businesses were thrown into chaos. Auto manufacturers like Ford and GM, which rely heavily on Chinese parts, scrambled to find alternative suppliers or renegotiate contracts. The solar industry, already struggling with supply disruptions, warned that projects could be delayed by months or even years due to the new import costs. Semiconductor firms raised alarms that the chip shortage, which had barely begun to stabilize, could be reignited by the higher tariffs on essential components. Comparisons to Trump's first-term tariffs were inevitable. Back in 2018 and 2019, tariffs on steel and aluminum were introduced with similar justifications: national security, economic fairness, and job creation. And while certain industries did see a temporary boost, U.S. steel production rose in the short term, others suffered. Agricultural exports plummeted when China retaliated by slapping tariffs on soybeans and pork. The trade war cost American farmers billions and triggered multiple rounds of emergency subsidies from the federal government. By 2020, many of the gains had evaporated, and consumer prices had already risen by measurable margins. This time, the administration insists it's different. The focus isn't just on punishing adversaries, it's on realigning the entire supply chain. The messaging is clear: America will no longer be dependent on adversaries for critical technologies. But critics argue that these policies come with unintended consequences and that the long-term damage to trade partnerships may outweigh any short-term gain. Behind the political theater lies a strategic shift. These tariffs aren't designed to negotiate better deals like before, they're designed to change the game entirely. To force companies to build in America or pay the price. To push consumers toward domestic products whether they want them or not. And perhaps most importantly, to send a signal that the globalized era of cheap imports, seamless supply chains, and international cooperation is over. What we're witnessing now is not a repeat of the past, but a redefinition of the future. This is where the line gets drawn. Not just between nations, but between economic ideologies. And in the next few years, we'll find out which model survives. The economic impact, short-term consequences in the months following the rollout of Trump's renewed tariff policy, the ripple effects on the American economy came fast, wide, and painfully visible. Though the administration framed the move as a long-overdue correction, one that would bring jobs home and force foreign powers to play fair, the costs were felt almost immediately by the very people it claimed to protect, the American consumer. It started at the car dealership. Electric vehicles, which were finally gaining momentum in the US thanks to falling battery prices and wider adoption, saw price tags climb almost overnight. Chinese-manufactured EVs, once poised to dominate the affordable segment, were pushed out of the market with 100% tariffs. American automakers, unable to absorb the sudden rise in component costs, passed the difference to buyers. Ford's entry-level electric SUV, once advertised under $40,000, now flirted with a price closer to $50,000. The result? A significant slowdown in EV's sales, a reversal of momentum in a sector that had just begun to challenge traditional gasoline vehicles. Smartphones weren't spared either. With most of the world's phone components, screens, chips, sensors, originating in Asia, the new tariffs inflated prices across the board. Retail chains reported a noticeable dip in new phone sales as consumers held onto their aging devices longer. The National Retail Federation issued a warning in its quarterly report, noting that tariffs on consumer electronics were distorting retail behavior and stalling economic activity in key growth areas. Solar panels, once the poster child of America's clean energy future, became a symbol of unintended consequences. Projects in California, Arizona, and Texas reported cost overruns due to the higher price of imported solar modules. Utility companies paused several planned expansions. Residential installers reported cancellations from homeowners stunned by the jump in installation quotes. The solar industry, which had enjoyed years of steady growth, suddenly found itself fighting to survive under the weight of costs it couldn't control. These price increases weren't isolated to niche sectors, they echoed across the entire consumer price index. According to data released by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, core inflation rose faster than expected in the second and third quarters of 2024. Economists initially blamed energy prices and food costs, but a closer look revealed a broader trend. Categories heavily dependent on foreign manufacturing were rising fastest: home appliances, electronics, cars, and even clothing. As tariffs drove up wholesale import prices, those increases bled into everyday goods, pushing inflation beyond projected targets. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce was among the first to respond with alarm. In a statement issued in July, they warned that the tariff-driven cost structure was acting as an artificial pressure cooker for inflation. Their report stated that the added costs would not be shouldered by foreign competitors but passed down the supply chain until they landed squarely on the American household. According to their modeling, the average family could see an annual increase of over $1,400 in basic living expenses by the end of the year, an invisible tax with no escape. At the Federal Reserve, policymakers took note. While interest rate hikes had previously been used to cool demand-driven inflation, tariffs introduced a different problem: supply-side inflation. It wasn't that people were spending too much, it was that the goods themselves were becoming more expensive to produce or import. Jerome Powell, speaking during a post-meeting press conference, acknowledged the difficulty of navigating an inflationary landscape where fiscal policy, in this case, tariffs, was creating friction with monetary policy. Raising rates might slow spending, but it wouldn't make semiconductors cheaper. Supply chains, which had only just begun to stabilize after the pandemic-induced chaos, were suddenly thrown into a new era of uncertainty. Manufacturers scrambled to find alternative suppliers, shifting orders away from Chinese firms to partners in India, Vietnam, or even back to domestic facilities. But rebuilding supply lines takes time, months, sometimes years. In the short term, it meant empty shelves, delayed product launches, and uncertain pricing. The Port of Los Angeles reported a noticeable decline in inbound cargo volumes in the second half of the year, confirming that major importers were either hesitating or restructuring entirely. Small and mid-sized businesses were especially vulnerable. Lacking the financial buffers of large corporations, many were forced into a painful dilemma: raise prices or cut costs. Some tried to absorb the blow, hoping for a reversal. Others began layoffs. A furniture manufacturer in North Carolina, dependent on Chinese hardware and foam, announced it would shut down 2 of its 3 plants. In Michigan, a solar installation firm laid off half its workforce, citing project cancellations directly tied to the rising cost of imported components. The irony was impossible to ignore. A policy designed to protect American workers was, at least in the short term, contributing to job losses. It wasn't the first time. Back in the earlier round of Trump-era tariffs, a similar pattern unfolded. While steel jobs increased modestly, downstream industries like auto parts and construction saw losses. A study by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York had concluded at the time that for every job saved by tariffs, multiple others were threatened or lost in other sectors. That historical echo now returned with chilling familiarity. And yet, despite the backlash, the administration maintained that the strategy was essential. They framed the hardship as temporary, a necessary correction to decades of unfair trade practices. Supporters echoed the sentiment, insisting that once the transition was complete and domestic manufacturing regained its footing, the benefits would outweigh the costs. But for many Americans, the pain was now. Their paychecks didn't go as far. Their purchases were delayed. Their job security suddenly felt fragile again. Economists warned of the hidden tax effect, a phenomenon where tariffs act as indirect taxation. Unlike income taxes, which are visible and often progressive, tariffs are regressive. They hit lower and middle income households hardest because those families spend a larger portion of their income on goods most affected by tariffs: basic electronics, vehicles, household necessities. Critics argued that this wasn't just economic policy, it was class warfare masked as patriotism. Business leaders, too, were recalibrating. Tech giants re-evaluated sourcing strategies. Auto executives discussed shifting factories to non-tariff regions. Retailers began adjusting product lines, favoring domestically produced alternatives, even if it meant reducing variety and increasing price. For consumers, it translated into fewer choices, higher prices, and longer waits. As the months passed, the message became clear. This wasn't just a bump in the road. It was a structural shift. A deliberate redrawing of the economic map. The short-term consequences were undeniable. But underneath the noise, something deeper was happening. And if tariffs were just the beginning, the next phase could carry even greater costs. The real beneficiaries follow the money whenever major economic policy shifts happen, especially those wrapped in patriotic language and political firepower. There's always one question worth asking. Who really profits? Behind the speeches, the rallies, and the promises of revitalized American jobs, the money always leaves a trail. And in the case of Trump's latest tariff push, that trail reveals something deeper than protectionism. It reveals a calculated redistribution of wealth, one that favors a select group of industries, donors, and insiders. At the top of the list are domestic steel and aluminum producers. When the new tariffs took effect, these industries didn't just brace, they surged. US Steel, once teetering on the edge of decline, saw its stock price spike in response to anticipated demand. With foreign competitors now priced out of the American market, domestic suppliers faced less pressure to compete on price or efficiency. Contracts flooded in from manufacturers scrambling to secure local sources. It was a windfall, one that executives had seen before during the 2018 trade war, but this time, the stakes were higher, and the protections even more aggressive. While many businesses were hit hard by rising costs, companies in industries shielded by the tariffs experienced a profit renaissance. Not only did they benefit from reduced competition, but they also enjoyed elevated prices, which customers were now forced to accept due to a lack of cheaper alternatives. This wasn't just economic policy. It was a market intervention, one that restructured competition in favor of a chosen few. Then came the politically connected industries. A closer look at lobbying data, especially through watchdog platforms like Open Secrets, reveals a compelling pattern. Many of the industries that benefited most from the tariff hikes had significantly increased their lobbying budgets in the 2 years leading up to Trump's new trade policies. Steel producers, mining corporations, and select technology firms had ramped up the political spending, targeting both congressional members and trade advisory panels. Campaign donations rose, PAC contributions flowed, and think tanks aligned with nationalist economic agendas suddenly found themselves flush with funding. In Washington, access often translates into advantage. And as Forbes-style financial analysis shows, the companies most insulated from the negative effects of tariffs were often those with deep political ties. Some had executives who previously served in government advisory roles. Others were major donors to super PACs that aligned with Trump's economic platform. The line between policy and profit blurred until it became almost indistinguishable. These weren't just industries catching a lucky break. They were stakeholders in the very system they helped shape. Even the federal government found itself benefiting from the tariff structure, at least on the surface. Customs duties collected at ports surged. According to estimates from the Congressional Budget Office, revenue from tariffs was projected to exceed $100 billion annually if current policies remained in place. That's more than double the figures from the previous administration. This stream of revenue came without a traditional tax vote, bypassing congressional gridlock and allowing the executive branch to essentially impose a new income stream without raising public taxes directly. But this is where things get murky. Because while the government collects the money, it's not evenly distributed. Much of it disappears into general funds or is reallocated to subsidize industries affected by foreign retaliation. During the last tariff war, billions were redirected to farmers who lost access to the Chinese market. That same pattern is already beginning to repeat. Once again, American taxpayers are footing the bill for a trade war that was supposed to hold other nations accountable. The irony is brutal. Consumers pay more at checkout, small businesses face higher input costs, and the government collects more revenue, only to turn around and hand it to the industries that helped write the rules in the first place. This isn't a free market. It's controlled capitalism. There's another layer to this web, one that doesn't show up in official reports. Behind the scenes, private equity firms and hedge funds are placing calculated bets. As tariffs shift market demand, investment portfolios adjust in response. Firms with early knowledge of upcoming policy changes, gleaned through connections, insider briefings, or high-level forecasts, are able to reallocate billions before the public ever sees the ripple. These silent beneficiaries never appear on camera. They don't stand next to factory workers at campaign rallies. But their profits grow with every disruption. In truth, the concept of economic nationalism sounds noble. Bring back jobs. Restore independence. Protect local industries. But when you peel back the layers, a different picture begins to emerge. One where those with influence craft a system that appears to serve the people while enriching the few. It raises a critical question: is this really about sovereignty, or is it a clever repackaging of old-school crony capitalism? History offers clues. The same arguments were used during the Smoot-Hawley tariff era nearly a century ago. Back then, tariffs were framed as a way to protect American farmers and manufacturers during a global crisis. Instead, they triggered retaliatory measures, tanked exports, and deepened the Great Depression. And yet, politically connected firms still made gains. The structure hasn't changed, only the players have. In today's landscape, those players are larger, faster, and backed by digital influence campaigns that shape public perception in real time. News cycles amplify patriotic messaging. Social media platforms are flooded with memes promoting self-reliance and manufacturing revival. But beneath the surface, massive sums of money are changing hands. Strategic acquisitions are being made. Quiet deals are negotiated in closed-door sessions. So while the public argues over whether tariffs are patriotic or reckless, the real winners are already banking their profits. These policies may be sold as a defense of the working class, but they're executed with precision for those who never have to punch a clock. This is the uncomfortable truth behind the reboot. It's not just about global trade. It's about power, access, and control. And as the economic chessboard shifts, the beneficiaries aren't always the loudest voices. They're the quietest, the best connected, and the most prepared to capitalize on a system they helped design. Global fallout, retaliation and the risk of trade war. The moment Trump's tariffs were announced, the rest of the world began calculating its response. These weren't idle policy shifts that quietly reshuffled global trade flows. They were bold economic declarations that landed like thunderclaps in Beijing, Brussels, and Mexico City. In international politics, moves like these never go unanswered, and retaliation wasn't just possible, it was inevitable. China, the world's second largest economy and America's largest goods trading partner, was the first to signal pushback. Although US tariffs targeted Chinese electric vehicles and tech components, Beijing saw the deeper implication, an attempt to decouple the two economies altogether. China's Ministry of Commerce issued a terse statement promising countermeasures. And if history is any guide, those measures will be swift and surgical. Back in 2018, when Trump imposed his first round of tariffs, China responded by targeting America's agricultural heartland. Soybeans, pork, and automotive exports were hit with retaliatory duties. The goal was clear: inflict maximum political damage by hurting industries located in states that supported the administration. The effect was devastating. US soybean exports to China plummeted by more than 50% in 1 year. Farmers, caught in the crossfire, found themselves reliant on emergency subsidies just to stay afloat. A repeat of that playbook is now in motion. Chinese state media has hinted at possible restrictions on rare earth exports, materials critical to the production of advanced electronics, electric vehicles, and defense equipment. Such a move would squeeze American manufacturers already grappling with cost increases from tariffs. At the same time, China is aggressively pursuing new trade agreements with nations in Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America, bypassing US influence and establishing alternative supply chains. The European Union's reaction is more cautious, but no less concerned. European leaders view Trump's trade strategy as a destabilizing force, one that threatens to unravel decades of carefully negotiated agreements. European automakers, in particular, stand to lose access to American consumers if tariffs expand to include vehicles from Germany, Sweden, or Italy. Brussels has begun preparing a case to file with the World Trade Organization, arguing that the tariffs violate long-standing trade rules. But in today's fractured geopolitical landscape, even the WTO's influence is diminished. G7 leaders, meeting in Canada, issued a joint communiqué calling for restraint and mutual cooperation. But the cracks were visible. Behind closed doors, there was open frustration with the United States for acting unilaterally. Allies questioned whether America was abandoning the very institutions it helped build. If trust continues to erode, retaliatory tariffs could emerge not just from rivals like China, but from traditional partners, turning the global economy into a patchwork of competing alliances and fractured supply chains. Mexico, America's southern neighbor and vital trade partner, finds itself in a delicate position. While the USMCA trade agreement still governs much of the economic relationship, Trump's new tariffs sidestep those provisions by targeting specific components believed to originate from Chinese-backed factories. Mexico has raised concerns through diplomatic channels, warning that the measures could violate treaty obligations. If tensions escalate, Mexico could respond with targeted tariffs of its own, possibly hitting sectors like U.S. corn exports or automotive parts where American businesses depend heavily on Mexican demand. The ripple effects aren't limited to policy documents and diplomatic statements. Global financial markets are already reacting. The Dow Jones Industrial Average dropped sharply in the days following the tariff announcement. Technology stocks were among the hardest hit, reflecting fears of disrupted supply chains and shrinking margins. European indices, including the DAX and FTSE, also dipped as investors braced for reduced export revenues. Emerging markets, which often serve as middlemen in complex supply webs, saw capital outflows accelerate as risk appetite dwindled. International banks have started issuing cautionary notes to clients. Goldman Sachs warned that escalating trade tensions could shave half a percentage point off global GDP growth by the end of the year. The IMF updated its outlook, reducing global growth projections and citing trade fragmentation as a primary concern. When major institutions begin sounding alarms, it usually means the pain won't be localized. This time, the shockwaves are global. Trade slows. Investment stalls. And as uncertainty creeps into boardrooms and balance sheets, hiring freezes and production cuts follow. It's a domino effect, and history has seen it before. The more fractured the system becomes, the harder it is to restore confidence. And unlike a conventional war, where treaties bring closure, economic wars tend to linger, metastasizing into long-term hostilities that alter how entire industries function. This is where the specter of a new kind of Cold War begins to emerge. Not a conflict of missiles or ideology, but of money, data, and dominance. Cold War 2.0 isn't about nuclear deterrence. It's about who controls the semiconductor supply chain, who leads the artificial intelligence race, and who dictates the flow of global capital. Tariffs, in this context, are not just trade tools, they're economic weapons. And the more they're used, the more normalized they become. Some analysts argue that we've already entered this phase. The US and China are decoupling their economies, building parallel systems that are less reliant on each other and more influenced by their own strategic interests. The tech world is splitting into digital spheres of influence, with Chinese and American standards diverging. Financial platforms are being regionalized. Even energy alliances are shifting, with the BRICS nations exploring alternatives to dollar-based trade. In this environment, every tariff becomes a statement. Every retaliation becomes a maneuver. And every diplomatic protest is part of a broader strategy. This isn't just tit-for-tat economics, it's a slow, deliberate severing of global interdependence. The world that was built on the premise of free trade and open markets is fading. In its place, a new order is rising, one shaped by self-interest, strategic decoupling, and competitive nationalism. What started as a simple tariff on electric vehicles has become something else entirely. It has triggered a chain reaction that reaches into every corner of the global economy. And with each new escalation, the possibility of rebuilding the old system slips further away. Historical echoes: have tariffs ever worked? Every time a new wave of tariffs is introduced, defenders point to the past. They talk about protecting domestic jobs, restoring industries, and building economic resilience. But history rarely delivers a simple verdict. The record on tariffs is long, complex, and filled with both triumph and disaster. And to understand whether Trump's latest tariffs will succeed, we need to look at the echoes of previous economic battles fought on the same ground. The most infamous example remains the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930. Passed at the height of economic anxiety during the Great Depression, it was supposed to protect American farmers and manufacturers from foreign competition. Instead, it deepened the crisis. Over 20 countries retaliated with their own tariffs, global trade plummeted, and the United States saw its exports cut nearly in half within 2 years. Industrial production collapsed. Unemployment soared. According to the National Bureau of Economic Research, the GDP contracted by nearly 27% between 1929 and 1933. What was meant to be a shield became a sledgehammer. That case has haunted economists ever since. It's why, for decades, mainstream economic thinking strongly discouraged protectionism. The global institutions built after World War II, like the World Trade Organization, were designed specifically to prevent another Smoot-Hawley scenario. But that didn't stop future administrations from experimenting with targeted tariffs, especially when political pressure demanded action. In the 1980s, President Ronald Reagan imposed tariffs on Japanese products, particularly in the automobile and electronics sectors. At the time, Japan's rise as an export powerhouse was seen as a threat to American dominance. The tariffs, along with so-called voluntary export restraints, did have a short-term effect. Japanese automakers reduced shipments to the US, and American manufacturers received some breathing room. But the long-term story tells a different tale. Rather than weakening Japan, the tariffs forced Japanese companies to adapt. They built factories on American soil, hired American workers, and integrated themselves into the US economy. Toyota, Honda, and Nissan are now some of the largest employers in several states. What began as protectionism ended in globalization. Academic reviews, including one from Harvard's Kennedy School, concluded that while Reagan's measures provided temporary relief, they accelerated structural changes in the auto industry that were already underway. In the end, the market shifted, not back to Detroit, but toward a hybrid supply chain that made traditional boundaries obsolete. Trump's first term offers the most recent and relevant data. In 2018, he launched tariffs on steel, aluminum, solar panels, washing machines, and eventually, hundreds of billions in Chinese goods. The stated goal was to level the playing field and protect American workers. And in certain cases, it worked, at least initially. The steel industry did see a modest uptick in domestic production. Prices rose. A few shuttered plants reopened. US Steel announced new investments. But the story didn't end there. Industries that used steel, like auto manufacturing and construction, faced higher input costs. That translated into higher prices for consumers and squeezed profit margins for downstream businesses. A Brookings Institution report found that while steel-producing states gained a few thousand jobs, steel-consuming states lost even more. The net impact on employment was either neutral or slightly negative, depending on the model. Agriculture took an especially hard hit. When China retaliated with tariffs on soybeans, pork, and corn, American farmers found themselves shut out of one of their most critical export markets. The Trump administration responded with tens of billions in subsidies to offset the losses, but many farmers still faced bankruptcy. By the end of 2019, farm bankruptcies had risen by nearly 20%. The subsidies may have softened the blow, but they didn't reverse the trend. Academic studies analyzing Trump's first-term tariffs presented a mixed picture. Research published by the National Bureau of Economic Research concluded that the tariffs reduced imports but did not significantly increase employment in protected industries. They also found that consumer prices rose, and real income for American households fell as a result. The average cost to households was estimated at over $1,000 per year, even before the pandemic distorted the data further. GDP growth during the tariff period also reflects the ambiguity. The US economy grew steadily from 2017 through 2019, but not dramatically. Growth hovered around 2 to 3% annually. That was consistent with pre-existing trends and not significantly boosted by the trade measures. Job creation continued, but again, it followed the same trajectory as prior years, making it difficult to attribute gains directly to the tariffs. Sector-specific pain points emerged as well. Manufacturing employment grew modestly at first, then slowed in late 2019 as trade uncertainty and higher input costs began to weigh on business confidence. Investment in manufacturing equipment declined, and some firms postponed expansion plans altogether. A report from the Institute for Supply Management showed that manufacturing activity contracted for several months at the end of Trump's term, signaling that the benefits of protection were not widely distributed. So have tariffs ever truly worked? The answer is complicated. They can create targeted advantages for certain industries in the short term. They can be used as negotiating tools to extract concessions in trade talks. But they also come with heavy costs, distorted markets, retaliatory strikes, reduced exports, and in many cases, higher prices for everyone. The economic data shows that while some firms benefit, the overall impact on the broader economy tends to be muted or negative. What history teaches us is that tariffs are rarely surgical. They're blunt instruments. They can signal strength, provoke fear, or serve political ends. But as long-term economic strategies, they often create as many losers as winners. And more often than not, the burden falls on the very people they claim to protect. The echoes from the past are clear. Protectionism is easy to sell, but harder to sustain. Whether it's the collapse of global trade in the 1930s, the strategic pivot of Japan in the 1980s, or the complex ripple effects from Trump's first term, one thing becomes certain. Tariffs might feel like economic warfare against outsiders, but their shrapnel rarely respects borders. It hits suppliers, partners, consumers, and workers alike, often without warning and without a clear path back. Beyond the surface, the Great Economic Reboot theory. It is a growing sense among economists, geopolitical analysts, and global investors that what we're witnessing now isn't simply another trade dispute. This isn't just about tariffs or economic retaliation. Something deeper is happening, an intentional reset of the global economic framework that has shaped the world for nearly a century. And at the center of this shift is the United States, using trade policy as the lever to tilt the balance. Some are calling it the Great Economic Reboot. Not a crisis. Not a collapse. But a recalibration of power, control, and production. It's a theory that suggests recent moves, from aggressive tariffs to rising economic nationalism, aren't reactive, but strategic. The goal? To prepare for a world where globalization no longer dominates and where American sovereignty in trade, currency, and manufacturing is not just preserved, but reinforced. One of the clearest signs of this reboot is the movement toward de-dollarization. For decades, the US dollar has been the dominant force in global trade, energy transactions, and foreign reserves. But over the last few years, several emerging powers have begun reducing their reliance on the dollar. China and Russia have already engaged in bilateral trade using their own currencies. Countries like Brazil, India, and Iran have started exploring alternatives to the dollar in energy and commodity markets. Even the BRICS alliance has discussed creating a shared currency for trade among member nations. At first glance, this might seem unrelated to tariffs. But it's not. Tariffs, when applied unilaterally and aggressively, push other countries to develop systems outside the US financial sphere. They act as both punishment and incentive, forcing countries to seek independence from the dollar-dominated order. And while this may weaken the global reach of the US currency in the short term, it also grants Washington the rationale to double down on rebuilding self-reliance at home. If the world is moving away from American-led trade structures, then Washington may feel it has no choice but to pull back and fortify what's left. Another key component of the reboot is the realignment of global supply chains. The pandemic exposed just how fragile the modern, hyper-efficient, globally integrated economy really is. Shortages of medical supplies, chips, batteries, and basic consumer goods made it clear that efficiency had replaced resilience. Now, resilience is back on the table. Companies are being encouraged to reshore production, diversify sourcing, and localize critical infrastructure. The tariff strategy fits perfectly into this new playbook. By making foreign imports more expensive, Washington is forcing corporations to rethink their global strategies. The era of just-in-time, low-cost manufacturing in faraway countries is being replaced by regional hubs and domestic capacity building. From semiconductors to pharmaceuticals, the message is clear: produce closer to home or risk disruption. Analysts like Peter Zeihan have long argued that the age of cheap, safe, global trade is over. He points to demographic collapse, aging infrastructure, and rising geopolitical tensions as reasons to expect fragmentation. The reboot, in this view, is not a choice, it's an inevitability. Tariffs are merely the first step in a broader pivot away from the assumptions that once drove globalization. Ray Dalio, founder of Bridgewater Associates, has also warned about the decline of empires and the cycles of power that follow. In his historical analysis of economic transitions, Dalio highlights the combination of debt, inflation, political polarization, and international conflict as signs that a major shift is underway. The United States, according to this framework, is nearing the end of one such cycle. Zoltan Pozsar, formerly of Credit Suisse and the US Treasury, has taken this even further. In his research on Bretton Woods III, a term he uses to describe the next evolution of global trade, Pozsar suggests that the future economy will be built not on financial assets and abstract systems, but on hard commodities and real production. He argues that the East is preparing for this transition by hoarding gold, building infrastructure, and reducing dependency on Western banking. If that's true, the West may be responding in kind, using policy tools like tariffs to re-anchor its own foundations. And this is where the theory of a controlled collapse comes into play. There are those who believe that the American government, or at least certain factions within it, understand that the old model is unsustainable. Rather than allow it to fail suddenly and without preparation, they're actively dismantling parts of the system, disengaging from global trade ties, tightening capital flows, and encouraging domestic production, even if it causes short-term pain. It's the economic equivalent of rebooting a corrupted operating system. You shut it down, wipe out what's broken, and start again with a clean slate. From that perspective, Trump's tariffs aren't random. They're systemic. They send a message not just to trading partners, but to investors, corporations, and institutions. The message is that globalization is no longer a guarantee. That security and control now matter more than efficiency and growth. That American policy will increasingly favor sovereignty over integration. The "America First" narrative plays directly into this. On the surface, it's about pride, borders, and jobs. But underneath, it's a strategic repositioning for a new global order, one that is less cooperative and more competitive. It's an admission that the rules have changed, and that playing nice no longer serves national interest. This shift isn't happening in a vacuum. Across Europe, Asia, and the global South, countries are reassessing their dependencies and alliances. Nations are building parallel systems, developing new trade corridors, and reducing their exposure to any single power, especially the United States. In response, Washington is doing the same. The Great Economic Reboot isn't about destroying the global economy. It's about replacing its foundation. And while it may be framed as a patriotic revival, its true aim could be something far more calculated, a transition to a post-globalization world where nations fend for themselves, trade within smaller blocks, and compete not just for markets, but for survival. Tariffs, then, are the opening act. The first lever in a much bigger machine. A machine designed to dismantle the interconnected structures of the past and rebuild a more controlled, more predictable, and possibly more fractured future. What looks like a trade war today may be remembered tomorrow as the moment the world economy began its next chapter. The question isn't whether the reboot is coming. It's whether anyone can stop it, and what kind of world will emerge once the reset is complete. The hidden strategy, political or economic master plan. As the economic dust swirls from Trump's aggressive tariff policies, a deeper question begins to emerge, one that stretches beyond economics and borders into the realm of strategy, influence, and power. Is this just a trade move to punish foreign competitors and protect American industry, or is it something more? Could the chaos unfolding in global markets actually be part of a broader, highly calculated plan? For some observers, the most obvious answer lies in politics. Tariffs are potent symbols. They're loud, confrontational, and easily marketed as action. To Trump's base, particularly in the Rust Belt and industrial heartland, tariffs represent a promise fulfilled. These are the regions that have seen factories close, jobs disappear, and communities hollow out under the pressure of global competition. By targeting imports and calling out countries like China, Trump revives a populist message that resonates deeply in these areas. It's not just about economics, it's about pride, nationalism, and a return to perceived fairness. In this context, tariffs are more than policy. They're campaign weapons. Each announcement reinforces Trump's commitment to America First. It keeps his base energized, fuels rallies, and reinforces the narrative that he alone is willing to stand up to foreign exploitation. And in a polarized political climate, that symbolism is powerful. It doesn't require complex explanations or economic charts. Just a bold statement: we're fighting back. But politics may only be the surface. There's a growing theory among economic analysts that the tariffs also serve as a pressure tactic aimed at the Federal Reserve. By creating inflationary pressure through higher import costs, Trump may be indirectly forcing the Fed to react. Traditionally, the Federal Reserve raises interest rates to combat inflation. But what happens when inflation is driven not by consumer demand but by government policy? The answer is murky, and that ambiguity could be strategic. Some speculate that the chaos induced by tariffs might actually be designed to push the Fed into cutting rates instead. If the central bank sees the economy slowing due to trade disruptions, it might lower rates preemptively to stimulate growth. That would, in turn, reduce borrowing costs and potentially fuel economic momentum heading into an election year. It's a risky move, but not an unprecedented one. Trump has long been vocal about his disagreements with the Fed, particularly during his first term, when he criticized Jerome Powell for not cutting rates fast enough. There's also the question of whether these tariffs are part of a deliberate effort to dismantle globalism. Not just in rhetoric, but in structure. Globalism thrives on interconnected supply chains, international agreements, and multilateral cooperation. Tariffs undermine all three. By erecting trade barriers, Trump is effectively rewiring the flow of goods and capital. Multinational corporations that once relied on smooth, cheap imports must now navigate a far more fractured landscape. This leads to a more controversial theory. one rooted in the idea of order through chaos. The concept suggests that by creating disruption, leaders can justify dramatic restructuring. In this view, tariffs are not just tools of protection, they are catalysts. They produce uncertainty, shake confidence, and expose the vulnerabilities of a hyper-globalized economy. And when the system begins to break, a new one can be introduced. One with tighter controls, fewer dependencies, and greater national sovereignty. Some call this conspiracy. Others call it strategy. But what's undeniable is the pattern. Trump introduces economic shock through tariffs. Markets react. Supply chains reel. Institutions scramble to adapt. And in the midst of that chaos, a new narrative forms. The old system failed, and the new one, built on domestic production and national strength, is the only viable path forward. Viewed through this lens, tariffs aren't just a trade mechanism. They're a control lever. They signal to allies and adversaries alike that the US is no longer interested in playing by the same rules. It's a rejection of multilateralism in favor of economic self-determination. And while the language may sound patriotic, the underlying structure reveals something much more strategic. There are historical parallels to this kind of maneuver. During times of major global transition, nations often adopt policies that seem self-defeating in the short term but serve a longer game. Economic pain is tolerated if it leads to strategic advantage. In the Cold War, for instance, the US and Soviet Union both imposed massive costs on themselves to shape a bipolar world order. The sacrifices weren't just economic, they were systemic. Entire models of governance and trade were reshaped in the pursuit of dominance. Trump's use of tariffs may be attempting something similar. By applying pressure, he's not just reacting to global shifts, he may be trying to lead them. By forcing economic realignment, he repositions the US as a producer, not just a consumer. He encourages the repatriation of industries, even if that comes at a higher cost. He challenges the foundational assumptions of globalism and dares other nations to respond. This isn't to suggest that there's a single mastermind behind every outcome. Economics is messy. Politics is volatile. And global reactions can be unpredictable. But the consistency of Trump's approach, the alignment with broader trends in nationalism, and the resulting chaos in international markets suggest that the policy isn't accidental. It follows a pattern. A pattern where disruption is the point. The implications are massive. If tariffs are being used as instruments of systemic transformation, then the fallout isn't a bug, it's a feature. Rising prices, supply chain dislocation, and foreign retaliation are all expected side effects in the pursuit of greater sovereignty. It's economic triage. And the patients are corporations, institutions, and trade partners that grew fat under a globalist regime. For voters, this strategy presents a double-edged sword. On one hand, it offers the promise of a stronger, more independent America. On the other, it demands patience, sacrifice, and acceptance of short-term hardship. Whether that message resonates depends largely on how the narrative is delivered, and who controls it. As the 2024 election cycle ramps up, expect tariffs to take center stage again. Not just as economic policy, but as campaign philosophy. Trump's brand of economic warfare isn't about quick wins. It's about changing the terrain entirely. The question is whether that terrain will still support the prosperity, stability, and growth that Americans have come to expect, or whether it will become a battlefield where only the most adaptable survive. Because in the end, if chaos is the tool, then control is the goal. And the more disruption we see, the more likely it is that we're not watching a random sequence of trade decisions, but the slow, deliberate construction of a new economic world order. What happens next? Scenarios for 2025 and beyond. As we look toward the horizon, the full impact of Trump's tariff-centered economic strategy is still unfolding. The dominoes have been tipped, the players have reacted, and the stage is now set for a series of high-stakes outcomes that could reshape not just the American economy, but the global financial order. While no one can predict the future with certainty, multiple scenarios are already emerging, each with its own risks, rewards, and far-reaching consequences. One possible future is defined by global backlash and a prolonged economic downturn. In this scenario, the aggressive use of tariffs pushes key trade partners to retaliate in ways that spiral beyond control. China, already signaling its intent to respond, could unleash a wave of countermeasures, including limiting access to rare earth minerals, launching cyber retaliation campaigns, or blocking key US exports. The European Union might file formal challenges at the World Trade Organization, while quietly preparing their own set of retaliatory tariffs to defend their industries. Even traditional allies like Canada and Mexico could harden their stance, fracturing relationships within North America. If these tensions escalate, they risk creating a chain reaction across global markets. Cross-border investment could slow as uncertainty grows. Currency volatility may spike as countries seek to defend their economies with monetary tools. Global GDP growth could shrink as companies delay expansion plans, pull back on hiring, and cut spending. The International Monetary Fund has already lowered global growth projections for the coming year, citing rising protectionism and trade fragmentation as core concerns. If this trend continues, a mild global recession becomes not just possible, but probable. Another scenario, more optimistic but no less dramatic, sees tariffs sparking a manufacturing renaissance within the United States. This vision is rooted in the belief that rising import costs will encourage companies to bring production home. Instead of relying on overseas factories, businesses will begin to invest in American workers, American materials, and American infrastructure. It's a scenario built on economic nationalism, and it echoes the industrial policies of mid-20th century America, when domestic factories were the backbone of the economy. In this version of the future, the pain of higher prices and short-term disruptions eventually gives way to renewed economic strength. New jobs are created in regions long left behind. Industrial towns experience revitalization. Technological innovation is accelerated as companies adapt to new constraints. Economists aligned with this view argue that a short-term shock could yield long-term resilience. They point to recent investment announcements in semiconductor plants, electric vehicle assembly lines, and battery production as early indicators that a reshoring wave might already be underway. But there's also a third path, one that combines elements of both the previous outcomes but adds a darker twist. In this scenario, the tariffs do not produce immediate benefits or rally global unity against the United States. Instead, they destabilize global trade just enough to spook investors, unsettle credit markets, and trigger a sharp correction across financial sectors. If global confidence in US leadership deteriorates, and foreign capital begins to withdraw from American assets, the stock market could suffer a significant drop. Already, analysts at major institutions like JP Morgan Chase and Morgan Stanley have warned of heightened market volatility tied to trade uncertainty. Such a crash could force Washington into an uncomfortable position. With markets tanking and economic confidence evaporating, the administration might be pressured into scaling back its tariff agenda or implementing emergency stimulus measures to stabilize the economy. This policy reversal would be politically costly and strategically confusing, signaling to global players that US policy is neither consistent nor sustainable. And in a world increasingly defined by power struggles, that kind of perception can be devastating. One thread running through all these scenarios is inflation. Regardless of the outcome, tariffs have already contributed to higher prices for goods ranging from electronics to vehicles to building materials. The longer the tariff regime stays in place, the more embedded those costs become. Some economists fear that the US is entering a new phase of structural inflation, an environment where prices rise not due to demand but because the system itself has changed. Central banks may find it harder to tame this kind of inflation without triggering stagnation. It's a problem with no easy solution, and one that could redefine how monetary policy is crafted in the years ahead. There's also the broader issue of strategic decoupling from China. While the rhetoric around tariffs focuses on unfair trade practices and domestic job losses, the underlying goal may be far more geopolitical. Washington's economic hawks have long warned of over-reliance on China for critical materials, components, and technologies. From pharmaceuticals to microchips, the supply chain vulnerabilities exposed during the pandemic are now being addressed with policies that seek to cut the cord entirely. If decoupling succeeds, the world could become increasingly bipolar. One system dominated by the United States and its allies, the other led by China and its growing network of trading partners. This would redefine globalization as we know it. The free flow of goods, capital, and ideas could be replaced by block-based economics where loyalty and alignment matter more than price or efficiency. Think tanks across the political spectrum are already modeling these outcomes. The Brookings Institution has warned that an uncontrolled trade war could permanently damage America's reputation as a reliable economic partner. Meanwhile, the Heritage Foundation sees opportunity in the chaos, arguing that strategic tariffs can be a necessary tool to rebuild American strength. Harvard's Belfer Center has begun publishing papers on the rise of techno-nationalism and the coming bifurcation of the world economy. And across Wall Street, investment houses are adjusting their forecasts and advising clients to prepare for greater volatility ahead. What happens next will depend not just on economics, but on leadership. Will the US double down on its current trajectory and weather the storm? Will other nations adapt or resist with equal force? Will consumers accept higher prices in exchange for perceived sovereignty? And how will markets respond if the signals from Washington grow even more aggressive? The answers are not yet clear. But what is certain is this: the rules of the game are changing. The global economy is being rewritten in real time. And whether that leads to renewed strength, painful disruption, or a completely new order will depend on the next decisions made at the highest levels of power. After everything we've examined, from historical case studies and international retaliation to strategic shifts in global trade, one truth rises above the noise. Trump's tariffs are not isolated actions. They are not random acts of economic aggression or simple campaign tactics. They represent the first deliberate step in a much larger transformation. A great economic reboot. These policies are not designed just to fix trade deficits or punish bad actors. They're signals, strategic markers that point toward a reshaping of how America, and possibly the world, engages with the very foundations of trade, currency, production, and power. The inflation, the supply chain disruptions, the retaliatory measures, they are not unintended side effects. They are features of a larger system being reset in real time. This isn't just about the United States putting America first. It's about a global reaction to decades of hyperglobalization, where efficiency was prized above resilience, where capital flowed freely while industries collapsed quietly, and where power drifted into the hands of a few transnational entities with no loyalty to place or people. The return of tariffs marks a pivot, away from that old order and towards something harder, less predictable, and far more nationalistic. Whether this shift will succeed or collapse under its own weight remains to be seen. Some argue that this is a strategic masterstroke, forcing the world to finally reckon with the unsustainable structure of global trade. They believe that with time, America will emerge stronger, more self-reliant, and better positioned to navigate a volatile future. Others see it as the opening shot in a global economic war, one that could spiral into prolonged financial instability, fractured alliances, and a world divided not by ideology, but by trade barriers and competing currencies. Both perspectives may be right. Or both may be wrong. That's the uncertainty we now live in. And that's what makes this moment so critical. Because this isn't a temporary phase or a headline-grabbing tactic. It's the beginning of something deeper. A rewiring of systems. A test of resilience. A confrontation between the past we built and the future that's coming, whether we're ready for it or not. So the question remains: is this bold leadership or calculated chaos? A necessary correction or an irreversible unraveling? A master plan or the beginning of an economic Cold War? Whatever the answer may be, one thing is undeniable: the global economy is being rewritten in real time. And whether that leads to renewed strength, painful disruption, or a completely new order will depend on the next decisions made at the highest levels of power. Whatever the answer may be, one thing is undeniable: The game has changed. The rules were rewritten.